the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we just want to mention we've got a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. But if not, leave us a review on iTunes. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a couple of pieces. The first is Freud's Mystic Writing Pad, and the second will be Derrida's Freud and the Scene of Writing. Going to be a nice little companion piece here, since Derrida mentions Mystic Writing Pad quite a few times in his writing, or in this piece, rather. From Writing Indifference, right? Was the name of the collection of essays, if I'm not mistaken.
That's it. Yeah, the collection of essays. This one's interesting in terms of Derrida's piece because it's actually like a lecture. It's bookended with like a preface and an epilogue by Derrida, really short little bookends of what he wrote, if you will, as supplements, to use a Derrida term, before adding this to the collection. So this is interesting because it's a lecture, but it's got written pieces on either end, just kind of summing up sort of what the lecture was going to be about, and then sort of tying things together, because I do think he ends with that quote from Symptoms, Inhibitions, and Anxiety that you posted earlier on Twitter today, about sort of writing in this like sexual metaphor in Freud, and walking on Mother Earth. It's constitute these like forbidden acts metaphorically. I think that's how he ends the lecture, in a nice little what the fuck moment. And then he
right.
He kind of extrapolates, okay, here's where Freud at odds but continuing in a kind of deference with the history of metaphysics. Here's how we could like apply these to 4 different fields, which the psychopathology of everyday life, which he kind of critiques Freud a little bit for making the direct analogy between slips of the tongue and slips of writing. Obviously, for Derrida, slips of the pen, slips of writing would be not simply an extension of slips of the tongue. That field itself should be considered. The other field was a history of writing, which he says is only sort of started to begin. And one can think that his initial publications of Writing Indifference, of grammatology, for example, would open up this field of a history of writing, becoming literary of the literal, right? So he's kind of saying until now, let's just say literary criticism in general is focused on literary signifieds. It needs to now start looking at literary signifiers, and what that means would be, I think, something close to what Kristeva might think of in terms of poetics, the revolution in poetic language. That would be my nearest analogy. Obviously, Derrida might mean something to the side of it, but I think that they would be in a similar field. And then the fourth one is a psychoanalytic graphology, which he points to Melanie Klein, which, I think it's just, insofar as psychoanalysis is to be interested in, let's say, something like the agency of the letter and the field of the unconscious, as Lacan, might say. I think it's sort of like Lacan is perhaps trekking out a certain area. Obviously, Derrida and Lacan are going to be, you'll see, it's probably still today, they're put in interesting conjunctions. So a psychoanalytic graphology, we can think of we can think of this essay on Freud and the scene of writing, on the mystic writing pad, etc., on the metaphor and analogy of the machineism of the writing pad in Freud's thinking of the psyche. I think that's part of what we could say constitutes an entry into what Derrida is calling a psychoanalytic graphology, right? What is the role of writing, not just in relation to the unconscious, but into temporalization, into all of these concepts that he's even calling into question, right? With some of the concepts he calls into question are consciousness, the unconscious, perception, memory, reality, all the stuff that he talks about in this essay, which might seemingly be givens or something conventionally understood, need to be kind of called into question, deconstructed. We'll get to Derrida soon. I think I mentioned to you, maybe we should start with Freud.
Yeah, it sets the scene or the stage.
Exactly. Sets the scene, the stage.
The originary violence of Freud's project.
And it's funny you mentioned the project, because one of what Derrida is trying to show is this shift from this neurological interest in 1895 with the Project for a Scientific Psychology that was never published during his lifetime, but that Freud was, I mean, he was gung-ho about it. He was invested in it. He was libidinally cathected in showing how we can see in this early writing, if you will, some of the earliest, around the time of Studies on Hysteria, co-written with Breuer, Freud is sketching out how certain things like memory and perception would work in a neuronal type of, let's call it serialism or whatnot, in the interaction of I'll just say neurons, but I think that spelling is interesting, neurones, with an E, because I don't think they are neurons in the sense in which we would take them in contemporary neurology, right? These are hypothetical abstract entities, but Freud is trying to sketch out through this system of different neurons, right? One for perception, one for memory, one for a kind of interstice and interlude between them. He's already thinking about how certain questions that he'll ask about the system that perceives, we could say, the quote unquote present, because obviously Derrida is calling into question the whole notion of a full present or of temporality itself, but a psychical system that is receiving excitations from the outside and in perception is not the same system that is actually recording. So the reception of excitations and the recording of them happen in two different systems. And this is a question that Freud will plague Freud, to the point where Derrida points out rightly that one of the last times it comes up, I think it's in the metapsychological paper, The Unconscious, which is a great paper. He'll restate the question about this: when, let's say, an unconscious trace is cathected and becomes conscious, is there a fresh registration in another system, in another locality, or is it really just a shifting, a movement of energies? Something that he's kind of not willing to answer, but he raises again this question of these systems and their quote unquote registrations, right there. It's not a question that he's willing to settle on, because it would be a speculative answer. Either way would kind of cut off certain avenues. So he leaves it as this open question. But in any case, that was one of the things that I remember very clearly throughout Freud's life, is this insistence that the permanent traces, although not unalterable, but the permanent traces left in the unconscious, the recording, the registration done there, is different than the perceptual conscious system receiving the excitations. One and the same system cannot record and receive excitations from the outside. So there is this like layering, if you will, already, even back to 1895 and the project. So Derrida is trying to think about this gap in time, the shift from a neurological basis in 1895 through the interpretation of dreams, which is really kind of supposedly the birth of psychoanalysis proper, up to the Mystic Writing Pad in 1925, that this question of the psychical system as a writing machine is, although it obviously takes form towards that later years, it's already there, like conceptually and inceptually, right? In the earliest of Freud's writing, the problem of perception and recording and memory. These are like classic questions for Freud. It may be just the metaphorical means of explaining them or thinking them through shift. So that anticipates what Derrida does. And we can now maybe talk a little bit more, if you want, about Freud in general, or about the note on the Mystic Writing Pad, the little 6-page essay that Freud has for us.
I mean, I think we should just go ahead and talk about the Mystic Writing Pad itself. And it's, I mean, you kind of hinted a little bit already towards the sort of topological structure of the metaphor of the Mystic Writing Pad and its different layers and different, I suppose, components related to perception and memory and the unconscious and versus conscious perceptions, etc., which I think is quite good. I mean, it's a very striking image. It's very easy to perceive, right? I don't know if, I mean, I recall we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, about actually having actually played with the Mystic Writing Pad, because I absolutely recall
That's really cool.
doing these, because it definitely adds. So you have a top layer, which is usually a sort of piece of plastic. Below that was a thinner, I don't know, like a carbon sheet or something that would sort of stick to the top plastic layer. And then you sort of use a stylus and, you know, draw or what have you. And so some of that pressure applied does leave permanent marks within the backing, which is like a black waxy backing. It's a softer material.
Right.
And so that's where the contrast, the way that the sort of, I guess, the carbon paper, we'll call it for black. I'm honestly not sure.
Right. Like
it actually is.
Is it kind of like tracing paper when you like trace comics and stuff? Is the top
It's almost like whenever, you know, I don't know, like the old duplicate sort of like, you know, like an old school credit card machine or something like that, where you're signing, like you would have multiple copies that would capture the initial signature, but it's like beneath that.
Right. Because it is in triplicate if you think about it, right? You got the top layer, as you said, you've got the middle layer, and then you've got the wax resin, the
kind of the substrate, let's call it, maybe.
Yeah, the substrate. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Which falls into, you know, a very clear metaphor for sort of the unconscious. It still does leave, if you press hard enough, it's going to leave an indelible mark in the wax backing. And once you pull up that top sheet, it'll basically is going to erase anything that was there previously and just leave a trace in the backing, which may not be visible, but is still physically present in the wax.
Right. And Derrida ends the essay with this, again, anticipating, calling into question. This is what he says Freud's most Platonic moment, when he says the analogy breaks down because even if that resin, that wax substrate retains those marks, it's not like our memory where we can't magically, it would be a real Mystic Writing Pad if we could pull at all times from the marks that's been made on that substrate. But we can't, unless we like visibly inspect it. We can't pull from the substrate up to the top. We can only go vertically down, if that makes sense. Freud saying in our memory, our substrate, we can pull from the substrate to the consciousness, to the top layer. But in the writing pad, you can't do that. Even if the substrate retains those marks like our memory, there's something more alive. This is his Platonic inspiration. There's something more alive in the actual psyche than in the dead machine. This is part of Derrida's point about life and death, these classical oppositions in metaphysics. So, I mean, I think that's already to anticipate, and that's really interesting. But yeah, I mean, we can,
maybe I can see if there's like, if you can still buy one of these things.
Yeah.
The link in the show notes or something, so people can kind of have a idea, a visual reference point.
Yeah, it is really interesting.
There's bound to be a video or something.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a video. Maybe there's a YouTube do it yourself, make your own writing pad.
Sounds right.
You know, maybe like some silly putty, something like that. maybe that's too malleable. But in any case, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, as Freud makes clear, if we didn't have the intermediary layer, right? If we only had the wax substrate and the top sheet,
which we could call a membrane.
If we only had the top membrane, it would potentially tear, rip. It would be subject to wear and tear. And I think this is Freud's point about, he had always thought about the fact that the perceptual layer, which is receiving excitations, needs a substrate. Well, I don't want to use that same word since it needs a kind of protective shell. There needs to be another layer, the intermediary layer, protecting from the intensity of the excitations,
right?
Whether it be the ego or the psychical apparatus. It depends on the formulation that Freud is working with, but there needs to be some kind of protective shell, and that breaches in these shells we can think conventionally lead to a kind of trauma that only after the fact, not Treglichite, right? Only après coup, after the fact, will lead to symptoms, let's say symptom formation, these breaches. But the breaches don't necessarily have to be from outside. I think Freud's point, his discovery in psychoanalysis, is they don't, obviously we can think of traumas externally. It makes sense that a large enough intensity of excitation from the outside could lead to breaches in the shell. We can imagine even the term that we think of, it's outdated now, but the term shell shock, obviously we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder these days, but there's a kernel of truth in the notion of shell shock. Specifically, I'm thinking of like this terminology that feels more relevant to like World War I or something like this, right? The reality of the brutality of the trenches, the artillery, the constant barrage of noise and other things. But for Freud, the more relevant to psychoanalysis, although not the only thing, because obviously external events happen, but it's the internal excitations from which we cannot run away and flee. The internal excitations of the drive, those breaches are the ones that perhaps interest Freud at least as much, which is why the question of, for example, like the Wolfman's primal scene of the dream of the wolves in the tree representing coitus a tergo, or whatever the fuck he calls it, the doggy style parental coitus. It doesn't matter if it's a fantasy or if it actually was perceived. There's a reality to the intensity that inside and outside don't really matter as much. Anyway, yeah. Anything else about the apparatus itself before we maybe talk about a little bit more about Freud's analogy with the psychical system? Although I guess I've already started talking about it.
There's a certain, I guess, relationship to the way that RAM, random access memory versus long-term storage on a computer would function in sort of a similar fashion. Like RAM is always rewritten versus the long-term storage, although that would be more in that kind of Platonic model of being able to retrieve the information. So it doesn't quite fit in exactly the same way, but I think maybe the RAM metaphor does sort of work for we'll put in quotes, the present moment or the present work, or like
right
work of perception or something. I
actually like your analogy here, and I
guess that goes to the machine a little bit too, right?
Yeah, I guess we're lay persons, so we're not going to try to step on the ground of computer scientists. Our friend Griffin would be able to help us here. RAM and ROM, or hard drive space, I think more accurately hard drive space and RAM. I think that's probably a better analogy even than the mystic writing pad, because then Freud would have to say would have to complicate Freud's Platonic inspirations, because to a certain extent, even when you delete files, quote unquote,
there's a trace.
There's still these traces that remain. So it is much more like the psychical, and so okay. You know what I'm saying? Like like the psychical and the machine opposition starts to break down a little bit when we look at computers And also it'd be interesting to think about whether Freud would be able to agree with the analogy in computer space, the way that files are stored, for example. A lot of times when they're deleted or stored, they are kind of stored in pieces, kind of like a torrent file is broken up into these pieces. So like, is there something similar? I think we could say there is, but is there something similar in the psychical apparatus, in the way that traces are recorded and the way memories are stored, quote unquote, in our psyche, that kind of brings into question this part whole analogy, right? Our memories, we can think about it that way, right? There's little bits and pieces of memories that a lot of times, one of the things that Freud says is, even if and I think Freud holds to this, that memories are permanent. He does hold to this. And whether or not that's true, I think that the speculative truth of it, whether or not it's factually true, is the fact that psychoanalysis is supposedly a means of accessing and working with these memories, even if they shift from quote unquote actual fact. There are permanent traces, and it's the shiftings that are interesting because it shows the effects of, we could say, repression, for example, right? In formation of symptoms. It's actually the memories that shift that are indicators of some sort of, let's say, pathology, symptom formation, something to work with. And it's the repressions that fail that are more interesting to Freud than the successful repressions. I think Derrida points that out early in the essay, because successful repressions would not leave a trace of their activity. We wouldn't be able to have an indication of symptom formation. It's the repressions that fail when something goes wrong, when the machine breaks down, that we get some sort of evidence to work with. Does that make sense, the way I put that?
I mean, the way that I thought of it was that because whatever the traces exist in the unconscious, like, sort of by definition, we're not aware of them. It's only when the symptom, and even then, right, like, we don't become aware of the trace until we go into analysis, and and through the unconscious speech reveal the sort of traces, something like that.
Right. I think this is why Derrida wants to relook at the psychopathology of everyday life, when he's saying Freud may be wrong to underestimate the importance of parapraxes, slips of the pen, and say that they're just extensions of slips of the tongue, right? That speech, in the way that you just said it, more generally encompassing also all the effects of language, including writing, that there should be particular attention paid to writing, and not just subordinated again to speech, like has been done classically in metaphysics. That's one of, obviously, Derrida's,
Right.
one of the first things he puts forward in deconstructing logocentrism, or whatever the fuck, is to show how writing has constantly sort of been subordinated to speech. And
Right.
one of the ways of doing this is, and this is what Derrida means by Freud's Platonism, the words that we see in the essay is hypomnesia or hypomnesic, right? Which is basically, memory is, because it can fail us, and we don't have to be neurotics, as Freud says in the opening sentence of the Mystic Pad, right? Even normal people need to sometimes write shit down to remember. I think the Platonic inspiration that Derrida is pointing out is that traditionally in logocentrism, writing has always been conceived merely as a kind of technical aid to living memory.
A supplement, right? Yeah.
A supplement to yeah.
It's interesting because I was kind of like, well, to me, logocentrism, to me, the written word seems more, to me, that falls into more what I would almost think logocentrism would be, because there's a certain linearity, there's a continuity, there's a very direct,
I see.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And not only that, but the ability to, like, go back and access that, right? Versus speech, once speech is gone, if it hasn't been recorded, then it's gone. So it's kind of interesting that he does this kind of reversal. Maybe that's sort of almost the point, right? Because, you know, I get the sense that, like, in the sense of the arche, or the archive of knowledge and writing, goes to science, that goes to rationalism.
Yep.
Versus speech would be more like akin to mythology and an inexactness in a sort of way. Like it's a mythology could be considered maybe like a human science, maybe the first human science, because it's trying to use symbols to say something about the world, like to make, right, you're making a hypothesis about the world, you're creating a theory. It's just not, there's no hard sort of evidence, and it's the oral tradition, right, versus the
Right.
written tradition. So I don't know, it's kind of a
Yeah, it does.
curious whatever antagonism there.
It does become interesting, this question of, I mean, we do have oral histories that are passed down. So
Yeah.
we know that speech and writing, when it comes to recording, can elide some of those classical oppositions that we see in the history of metaphysics. And you're right about mythology being this attempt to explain origins for which we have no real means of proving scientifically. There is a means of investigating the world, whether it be symbolically or whatnot, by positing origins from something that is unknown. But obviously, as Derrida wants to point out, right, all origins are already displaced, deferred. They're always already the originary is always already repeated. And Freud does this too, not just with origins, but with anything original. He's thinking of them as repetitions, like when in the negation essay, and we talked about this, I think, with Alenka Zupančić, right, when he's talking about the question of finding in the outside world that which accorded with the good that we took inside. It's always a question of refinding the object, not of finding that original object. It's always this repetition, this reproduction of a quest. But in any case, yeah, I mean, I think that for the Platonic, and again, Plato is going to set up a lot of these logocentric, at least, oppositions. If we remember in the Phaedrus, Socrates is, so to speak, like when he's first meeting with Phaedrus in the grove and blah blah blah, he's like hiding this little, he's like looking down and he's hiding, and he's reading this speech, and it doesn't sound anything like a true spontaneous beautiful speech. And then he kind of like gives a lie and says, okay, I was reading this thing, the real book is like inside us, blah blah blah, right? I think that it's this opposition between the dead letter of a past that can never really be present fully versus the full presence of speech. The dead letter can't be resurrected to like provide arguments for itself, whereas the dialogical present, I can provide,
Right. Yeah.
I can provide defense. You can, yeah. So I think that that's where Derrida is saying Freud is at his most Platonic when he says the writing pad analogy fails when we consider that I can't retrieve from the writing slab in any accessible way what has been written on it. Once that sheet is lifted, at a certain point, we're going to find a whole, if we examine the slate, the substrate, we're going to find a whole series of traces that coincide in such a way that they're illegible. We can't pull upward from the slate to the sheet like we can in living memory.
Also in reverse, yeah. Like,
so I think that's where Derrida puts some pressure on to show that Freud, in complicating temporality, etc., speech and writing to a certain extent, and presence in the history of metaphysics, also continues it, right? This is almost the sublation, if you will, of the history of metaphysics in Freud. It's not the word that Derrida used, but one could see it being used easily, that there is a kind of complication and a higher stage, a higher scene of writing in Freud, but it also repeats some of these classical oppositions.
The idea of the originary and the trace, I don't see how you quite undermine the originary with the idea of the trace per se. Like, I don't know if I can I don't know if I fully agree with Derrida there. Like, I sort of do in a way, but like,
what do you mean?
I suppose it'd be like the impact of the excitation, if it is leaving a trace in the psychical apparatus, and that trace is accessed in a certain way later in the conscious mind to some degree, or like impacted by the conscious mind, then how are you really undermining the originary? With Wolfman as the example, right? It's like his witnessing of his parents having sex then expresses itself in the dream. So there is an originary.
Two things. One, I'll start with the Wolfman. First, we don't have factual evidence to know, and this is this is part of the oscillation, whether or not that was actually perceived. Freud tries, and this is part of what Laplanche tries to bring out, especially in his writings. But Freud is not quite sure, and this is what leads him to abandon the seduction theory in the 1890s, where he's always looking for quote unquote actual events in the external world that happened in childhood sexuality, like molestation, rape, etc., that would cause these pathologies that he's seeing. And he realizes that, in fact, the opposition between fantasy and reality is not so hard, or not so hard and fast.
Right.
And so we're not sure in the Wolfman, even if Freud continues this, again, he calls into question his initial opposition between fantasy and reality. Even if he calls it into question with the Wolfman, he's still trying to go back to this primal scene. And for him, in the last instance, if you had to push him, even if he makes certain suggestions otherwise, it seems like he's still trying to pinpoint an actual event that happened that was perceived and thereby gave genesis to the fantasy. Derrida's trying to say, like, look, no, Freud has it right. When he's questioning that opposition and deconstructing it, he has it right that the origin is not necessarily the actual, right, versus the fantasy. The fantasy isn't necessarily the derivative of or the repetition of an actual event. This is the importance of something like primal repression, where there is this, and itself is displaced, right? But there's supposedly in Freud this originary repressed that gives rise to the activity of secondary repressions proper that's what we consider in psychoanalysis. Secondary repressions are based on this primal nexus of repressed. And I think for Derrida, that opposition is the same type of opposition that we find in fantasy and reality, and also the same type of opposition we find in speech and writing, whereby writing would be subordinate to speech. Whereas I think Derrida is trying to show, push far enough, we can see that writing actually makes speech possible. In, for example, if we go like with Freud to the way that the psychical apparatus works, how are we to have a differentiation into ego, id, superego, or into unconscious, conscious, preconscious without the layering of traces,
right?
And the
without an inscription surface,
right? Exactly. How are we to have speech, so-called the traditional classical notion of speech, without some sort of mechanism of writing already at work in the formation of our psychical apparatus? We're not born with an unconscious. I kind of agree with Laplanche on this. We're not born with an unconscious. We aren't born with the ability to speak. That's what infant means in enfants, right? Speechless. There is a learning development. And we don't have to look at psychoanalysis for this. Obviously, there's all kinds of
feral children and so forth.
Right. And there's all kinds of experiments in psychology and scientific works on this stuff. I'd say scientific as opposed to psychoanalysis, because let's be fair, science in the hard sense, right?
Yeah.
Again, I'm bringing up these classical oppositions that can be deconstructed, but only for the sake of expedience.
Sure.
And I think that's part of the problem too, that we have to be very careful. This is part of the hysterical aspect of reading and talking and writing about Derrida. There's a point at which you start to, I'm just thinking of one of my first teachers. He would have been in grad school probably in the early 90s. And he's just telling me about like his Derrida phase, and he saw it too in his friends. Like there's a point which you just start to like imitate and repeat Derrida. You start to do Derridian moves. It is kind of a hysterical thing. One can start, because now you're starting to like deconstruct and unbinarize and sublate everything. I imagine this happens in a lot of these prominent thinkers when one starts to like kind of circle the drain, if you will. of these oppositions and these means of these modes of speech. That's the thing, like for expedience sake, we do sometimes fall on these conventional notions and then have to catch ourselves, right? And kind of call these things into question. That's one of the things that I think in Anti-Oedipus, right? When they first bring up Derrida, which I believe is in chapter 3, the famous anthropological chapter, right? Savages, barbarians, civilized men, where they are looking at the development of writing. For them, they agree with Derrida very much, right? That in fact, if we look at it, writing, speech presupposes writing, right? Because for them, marking is primordial, right? Desire plants flags and bodies and marks them. This is the marking
The
out
system of cruelty, yeah.
of a territoriality, of a code. Exactly. It doesn't start with exchange. This is their entrance into the debate of anthropologists and ethnologists, and even to some extent economists, if you will. You don't start with exchange as though bodies were already marked by some sort of natural value, let's say, or a natural code inherent in all things. In fact, territorialization, the territorial machine, begins with coding, with marking.
Is that the primal repression? I'm glad you did bring that up.
Mm-hmm.
Just to clarify, what is the primal repression per se, or is that even? Am I like?
I would say I don't want to.
Does that? Let me give you my
go for it.
Sort of speculative bullshit here would be like, okay, it's almost like whenever the membrane comes into play, like whenever life emerges and folds back on itself to create a membrane between itself and the world, is that the primal repression?
What I would say, and I'm going to use like Laplanche's terms, because Laplanche takes Freud's seduction theory, which was jettisoned and got rid of. He generalizes it and universalizes it, whereby he says, look, when we are born without an unconscious, even if we have as we know from how life works, we have that potential to develop one. So as we are growing from the very first, I think Laplanche is thinking about the fact that, for example, and we know this from experience, that children need skin to skin contact. We could look at that. They need attention, love, blah, blah, blah. In the very act of caregiving, the adult is giving off unconscious sexual, he calls them sometimes shards, he calls them sometimes messages, and they are indecipherable and they're not just indecipherable to a certain extent for the adult, but obviously for the infant without an unconscious. And they embed, almost stake out and invest a part of the psychical system that will develop around these little unconscious, indecipherable messages. They will kind of stake out, if you will, the territory that will, so
like the partial
develop.
Objects.
We could call them partial objects to a certain extent, except that I think that the partial objects involved would be the most general one that even Freud looks at is, and Deleuze and Guattari, they start their Anti-Oedipus with, is the
mouth and the breast.
The mouse and breast machines. And it's not to say that even if there is a pleasure, so to speak, accorded to the it's even in the pleasure given to the child, but also the pleasure received from the mother, let's say.
Right. Yeah.
Even in that, there is a sexual indecipherable message. And again, this is why it's generalized and universalized. It's not that there isn't a conscious activity of seduction on the part of the mother or the caregiver.
Reminds me too of our discussion on transference love as well.
Exactly.
Not to like derail us per that, but just just brought it back to mind.
You're right. And in the transference stuff, when Freud first theorizes transference, he uses metaphors of writing. He says, what are transferences? They are new editions or facsimiles of fantasies and impulses that are brought to light during analysis. So he's using this notion of as though there are these reprints. I think I mentioned that in our episode. But in any case, so in terms of the primal repressed, I think Laplanche makes an advance over Freud, who's never quite clear about what is this primal, what is this originarity, this primordial nature of the repressed. But that unconscious, let's say, nexus that is implanted in the child only it is, again, this is the latency period. It's only with maturation, as we grow psychically and intellectually, and as we also go through puberty and are able to develop the wherewithal. And again, this is all highly individual, not just on the ontogenic sense, but in the way in which psychogenesis works in its associations of ideas, blah, blah, blah. But in our maturation, when we finally develop, not just intellectually, but sexually, and we develop the skill set, if you will, the know-how, but also just the intelligence, the maturity, etc., to start to decipher unconscious sexual elements, we're already constituted, if you will, from all of that caregiving in the initial stage. Because for Laplanche, he looks at Freud's initial notions. He calls it, in Strachey calls it the anaclitic, but it's this notion that our self-preservative drives, for example, eating, right, feeding at the breast, the sexual drive leans on the self-preservative drive. They're, so to speak, inextricable at first, and then they start to diverge at a certain point. After we have overcome the initial stages of our helplessness, after we begin to develop and mature intellectually and unconsciously, and then we enter that period where sexual messages are able to be decipherable. Sometimes children are very precocious for, it could just be random reasons. Other times it could be because they are subject to overt sexual seduction and molestation, whatever. These things can happen, but they happen at their own time and pace, and it's highly individual. And then it's with that we were able to, let's say, see the effects of what we might call the primal repressed, which would be these embedments of these messages around, like, this constellation of these shards of unconscious sexual messages that have been laid down, that trekked out the path. And this is the path breaking that Derrida is interested in the excitations of the psychical system, that break out these paths and lay down these roads for associations to travel, let's say. So I think that's part and parcel of what Laplanche is talking about, something in different language, but in the same thing that Derrida is interested in the beginning of this essay, with this notion of a path breaking, of a laying down of a way or of a road for excitations to travel, which, not just constitute the means of movement of excitations in the dream, but in the psychical system in general. That's how I understand the primal repressed, is that from the get-go, there are these unconscious embedments of psychical material that will coalesce and congeal and constellate, for which later, once we can consider ourselves active, free individuals, we have no real sovereignty over. We're sort of already, by the time we were able to decipher those messages, even if we can't retrieve them consciously, but by the time we were able to decipher sexual messages in general, or even messages in general, right? Because we're obviously not born with that writing apparatus either in the psychical. That's when the primal repressed has already constituted what will become our unconscious and the way that it functions amidst the other systems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
So it's not like there is a first event, even like, because let's say Freud thinks 1.5 to 3 is when the wolf man sees his mother and father in the bedroom fucking. It's not that constitutes the primal repressed. That's a part of it, even if a significant part that may have happened to form it. But again, this is all the thing. Like, did the unconscious sexual message transmitted from the mother to the baby in the first breastfeeding, is that some kind of primal scene? No, not for Freud, not in the sense in which he thinks it. But to a certain extent, it contributes to the beginnings of what will be, quote unquote, the primal repressed. And the primal repressed is what sets the machine in motion for secondary repressions. The repressions proper that we think about when Freud is generally talking about repression, he's talking about secondary repression, unless he really is trying to think about this origin story. But to a certain extent, I mean, like, even with Laplanche, these sexual messages, these undecipherable messages, are already repetitions. There's nothing really primal about them because the adult was a child, was an infant once. The system goes back. There's no chicken egg, if you will. The system of indecipherable sexual embedments of these messages goes back in time. There's no original pervert, if you will, there's no primal pervert of the horde who first implanted these messages, if you will. There is no origin for it. Even if there may be we could say an individual origin, there's an infinite regress in the line of individuals. This is why I don't really like to talk too much about primal repression. I think it's a term that Freud really starts using around the Schreber case. It's fairly late if you think about it, in 1913, that Freud starts really trying to suss out primal repression and secondary repression, and inform this theory about how is it that the unconscious is attracting this gravitational force of repression from below, whereas there's also from above. How is it that there's this fore pressure? Because I think for Freud, it takes an immense amount of psychical energy. And I've said this before to you, the systems are working in conjunction to repress from above and to repulse from above and to attract from below, so that repression can lock together these symptoms and ideas in symptom formation. And obviously we can't necessarily, obviously the work of working through, of being able to work through memories and symptoms in order to sort of recathect and reorganize the libidinal investments in order to open up the space for associating ideas differently and filling in links that have been broken or if you will, twisted and mangled, and be able to reconnect the repressed ideas and get them in such an organization that they can be vented and abreacted, blah, blah, blah. All of that, I think, for Freud, in terms of psychoanalysis and the working through, by the very fact of making part of this conscious, even if that's not the whole thing, but that begins the ball rolling, it obviously loosens the unconscious grip as well. We can't have direct access to the unconscious, obviously, right? Unmediated, but there's part and parcel. Liberating that psychical energy expended in the repression of ideas has to work both ways. And I think that for Freud and the transference as a resistance, that shows too how the unconscious it wants to kind of retain, if you will, that original configuration of the primal repressed. And it's the transferences that are means of resisting as we get closer to that traumatic node, that kernel, to unlock and loosen. There's a little bit of backlash and a means of trying to keep those configurations from becoming metastable, right? There is an inertia in the psychical system, I think, at that level.
It is pretty interesting that I think it was Derrida that said life protects itself by repetition.
I think he says that, yeah, towards the end of the essay, right? I remember this clearly. You're right. Let's see if we can find it.
Wouldn't that sort of go to Death Drive or something? Or just the repetition of the symptom?
Yeah, I mean,
because like you said, it sort of stabilizes around, like it stabilizes the, I don't know, the structure of the right? It creates the sort of writing surf. I don't know.
It keeps those pathways periodically cathected, and so the repetition of periodically cathecting those pathways is a kind of security system. It is a stability system.
I mean, even reproduction, like sexual reproduction, would be a means of life protecting itself. This is where I was getting into the whole like idea of the membrane in the like organism, which goes into a whole other diatribe I had about like death as repressed, death being the first thing that's repressed. To go back to, it's this choice of, do I want to sort of die on this installment plan, or do I want to take my death immediately, right? Because there's no purpose for me to live, right? I have to repress death in a sense to give myself the means by which to invest in life, right?
Right. There's
Because
no
what's the
pre-given purpose. There's no
exactly?
pre-given
Yeah,
purpose for me to live. You're talking about Baudrillard, right? And
yeah, to
the
some
opening
degree.
chapter of,
But I mean, this
but you're trying to link
becomes
it, right? You're trying to
right.
link it.
Exactly. That was the trace that was in my head, perhaps from those discussions. Derrida says that death sort of makes life possible, but it also like those are strange dialectic at play with death making life possible, but also ending life. The end the Nachtraglichkeit almost of death, sort of creating a purpose in some type of weird Heideggerian sense. I don't know. I'm being a little bit sloppy, but I
Well,
don't know if you can
our being toward
sense what
death
I'm.
is that opening of projecting our possibilities in this futural sense, right? So yeah, I didn't see the thing about life per se, but he does say in looking at the how the writing pad functions, and we said there's that intermediary celluloid layer that protects
Yeah,
the top layer. He says the fine wax paper would be scratched or ripped without it. There is no writing which does not devise some means of protection to protect against itself. I think that that's part of, we could say, if Freud likens the protective layer to a kind of dead layer, if you will, just as there is, we could say there are, we can think about dead layers of skin or something that happen just in the course of regeneration of cells. There is a kind of dead layer or a deadened layer that protects life against itself, against life. That's how I would read what you're trying to say. Yeah. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, no, totally. That you're right on. I think we've had this discussion too about the single-celled organism, like creating a membrane.
Yeah,
and
maybe
that's where I was thinking about. Okay, there's almost like, maybe to abandon Freud, like, and just use the concept of primal repression, but like this is a literal primal repression that creates life, a sort of death that creates life in a sense.
So you're likening primal repression to Freud's speculative investigation of biology when he looks at the single-celled organism and how it has a protective layer.
Exactly.
There's a kind of repression of the quote unquote, we could use Derrida here, the full presence of life. There needs to be this sublation of an exteriorization,
right,
in order to protect from, obviously, the outside stimuli and excitations are necessary, are, we could say, part and parcel of life. But there needs to be some sort of intermediary, some sort of membrane that perhaps we could
to keep the organism from
being
just like
dead.
Right. Interesting. I thought.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And again, we are using conventional terms, life and death. Even Derrida does here in this essay. But I think that you're right to liken the protective layer to a dead layer, a dead end layer, because that's not that intermediary is not the one that receives the excitations. It's meant to protect. Does that make sense?
Well, I think that the top layer would protect, the layer below would receive the excitations, as well as the third layer, like the waxy substance. We mark down on the plastic piece, right? The plastic piece protects the layer below, which sticks to the wax.
Right.
And that pressure.
Okay, sorry. So yeah. You're right. I misspoke. I see what you're saying.
Just to clarify a little bit.
Yeah, no, you're right. But we need that protective layer. We need that protective layer.
Without death, would we destroy our, like, you know what I mean? Would the organism be destroyed because it would seek out the intensity would destroy it? The drive would seek out some type of experience that would rupture the whole organism or something like that. I don't know.
There would be too much life. There needs to be some sort of, whether we think about it again as a container to contain the sort of vital substance. Obviously you can think about all kinds of traditions, even in like the atomists, like Lucretius considers the soul to be the lightest atoms, but it needs the body's airtightness, and it's upon death that airtightness gets ruptured.
Substance needs a mode or something, right?
Well,
maybe I'm fucking that up, but it just kind of reminded me a little bit of our discussion with Gil last week.
I guess we could go down that road, but it would require a lot of translations.
Yeah. Which is also brought up, interestingly enough, in this in this essay.
Yeah, I like this notion that Derrida looks at these aspects of Freud calling translation into question. And I think that it's good because what Freud is trying to do is to try to say that the writing we consider as a part of the psychical apparatus and of dreams in particular is not any kind of conventional writing. We can translate conventional writing to a certain degree, but if we translate dreams, we lose something because there is, as Derrida points out,
materiality doesn't transfer.
There is a materiality of speech
or translate.
Exactly. There is materiality of speech. And this is why Freud either calls dreams something closer to picture puzzles or rebuses. It's the very fact that I think Freud is trying to, even while retaining certain aspects in conventional interpretation, he wants to say that dreams cannot be codes. If they were codes, then they could be easily translated. They are not codes. They're not merely pictorial either. They're not just these pictures that have a code that would decipher them. They are a whole mixture of, well, I think for Freud at least, they are, and this is where I think the life-death stuff, right? Because death would be representation as a means for, as a necessary means, if you will, but not a replacement for the life of difference and whatnot, the elan vital of difference. But in any case, yeah, I mean, dreams are rebuses, right? So you can have, and this is what Deleuze and Guattari are thinking about in the opening chapter of Anti-Oedipus and the Desiring Machine chapter, when they're like, you got an anus and you might have a word here, and you know, you've got all these little organs, but you've also got some excrement. And of course, for them, it's not about interpreting. It's how the machine functions, the desiring machines function. It's not about interpreting them.
What does it produce?
So I think that's where, too, you know, one could push back on Derrida, but we're not doing Deleuze and Guattari today. I just meant to say they're thinking of rebuses, where you can have an image or a picture, doesn't necessarily matter initially what it represents, and then a word. And I think for Freud, his question is, where is the determining level for each of these things? And I think this is too where Freud doesn't like treating schizophrenics, right? He's treating neurotics who are obsessed with this question of meaning. So it makes sense. It works for the talking cure and interpretation. But and Deleuze Guattari quote him, he doesn't quite like schizophrenics because they treat words as things and vice versa, right? Thing representations and word representations on the level of schizophrenic are at equal play. And so to a certain extent, their speech is much more like the dynamics of dreams, which, while Freud loves interpreting dreams and understands that, in analysis, I think this goes back again to that kernel of fantasy reality. There is a sense in which, in the case histories, Freud is trying to get back to that kernel of reality to lay the basis for which fantasies can arise. And if reality and fantasy begin to conflict and cohere, and then the truth of fiction comes about, that kind of threatens the stable basis for the means of interpreting symptoms. Even if not ready-made or fully clear, there needs to be at least a working differentiation between the fantastical and the real.
I get a bit confused here because then Derrida goes on to talk about, he doesn't go into it very much, but he almost like the cipher and the almost like the crypt, what is it?
The cryptogram?
Yeah. Or there being some sort of singular cipher that would allow you to translate the dream into.
But this is what Freud is critiquing. This is what in the first chapter of the interpretation of dreams, he will go to the point of almost sketching a kind of rough history of the interpretation of dreams, and say that some of the most sophisticated have come up with a kind of dictionary, if you will, of dreams, whereby certain images will always correspond to certain interpretations.
Yeah. Well, Derrida talks about this too.
Yeah, he does. And
he talks about I think the Egyptians who already had their like practice of dream interpretation, but it was predicated on their pre-existing vocabulary of interpretations or meanings or like symbology or something.
And Derrida is trying to bring that up, the Egyptians, insofar as he's showing, I think he's quoting Warburton, who shows that the gods gave humans writing hieroglyphs,
Right.
but they also give dreams. And so there's an analogy, this quote unquote ontotheological basis for translating dreams by a code. And Derrida and Freud to a certain extent, but Derrida specifically is trying to obviously call this into question. Freud calls it into question. Derrida is trying to highlight how Freud does it. Because if dreams were translatable, we would lose the kind of focus on individuation. And I'm not just talking about, again, biological individuation, or really we're talking about psychical individuation, the way in which psychical systems for each individual repress and associate ideas highly individually. If all our dreams could be reduced to the same code and there would be some sort of universal Tower of Babel, some sort of dictionary that could translate them, I think that we would lose. Obviously, we would be more like Borgs and cyborgs, all be running the same operating system, right? And even if roughly that might be true to a certain extent on the hardware, on the software level, this is like Freud's trying to show, like, dude, we're not always working on that level. Everyone has, again, psychical systems, repressions of ideas are highly individual and highly malleable, and therefore there's no universal translation code for them.
Which I think even goes back to, again, our discussion with Gil a little bit to some degree, not to get too far into that, but I think we did discuss something along the lines of the different stimuli that you face in the world are going to sort of shape the way that you respond to other stimuli in the future, right? And that can be highly individual.
Yeah,
right, like what excitations are you exposed to at what time and so forth. And
what
so
affects,
yeah,
what
exactly.
constellation of affects
Precisely
are composing, the forces are composing with your mind and your body to affect and be affected. I think that Spinoza would say, he says something similar about our association of ideas lead us to be affected and increase and decrease our power in highly individual ways. Even if he's generalizing the ways in which these forces work, he's not, again, thinking that we all have the same associations, even if we may form associations in a general way. And I think this too is what Freud believes. The associations to which we are kind of constrained to form due to our psychical life and to external events are obviously highly individual.
Yeah, it's like we're condemned to a process, but not a determined response or something like that. We're determined to respond, but the way that we respond is not determined. And so that's where the difference between individuals and their repressions can arise or something like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We didn't talk about Nietzsche last week, but I think about how Nietzsche will use a kind of term that I could see Derrida deconstructing, but Nietzsche likes to talk about our constitutions, certain constitutions. And I think for Nietzsche, he wants to see certain philosophies are direct outcomes of certain constitutions. In fact, I think for him, different philosophies represent different modes of health and well-being, and it's our constitution. I love he talks about in Twilight of the Idols, which is a text we've talked about. He talks about some obscure at least, Italian dietary writer who lived to be 112 or something and ate nothing but like beans and rice all day. And Nietzsche's like, no, it's because you had this constitution that you ate, that you were susceptible to eating this. And it's not because you ate this that you had this long life. So I think that he's thinking about these things, again, as I said, that could be deconstructed, this sort of physical constitution, this what our bodies are, what sort of our bodies are, have tendencies to be predisposed to based on sort of what composes well with their powers. And yeah, I think that that's why we can think about how people might react in the face of certain situations based on, again, their predispositions, their constitutions, whether rightly or wrongly. But yeah, they're highly individual. And I think that's the same with dream what was it that Derrida says? I don't think he's quoting Freud here, but he's extrapolating where he says the dreamer invents his or her own grammar. And that's, again, what complicates translation and why Freud not only will rely on the metaphor of writing, but will also complicate it. Because one can imagine private languages being susceptible to translation if one had a code. This is part of, like, I watched this the other day. This is part of the movie's called The Turing Test. We talked about it with this Griffin, right? But like it goes into Alan Turing's, like, dramatizes his supposedly his first homosexual love, but his falling into love with cryptography and being able to write these little messages in code to one another, you know. So I think that idea of writing is a classical idea of writing that I think Derrida wants to call into question with grammatology, with graphology, the psychoanalytic graphology, right? That it's that type of writing that Derrida wants to show Freud calls into question. Even when he relapses into a classical metaphysical logocentrism, there are aspects of Freud in the scene of writing that are admirable for pushing past a kind of metaphysics of presence, because the dream is not, even the rebus is not a good representation of what the dream supposedly does and is, because it's a scene. It is a dramatization of ideas, to use kind of Deleuzean language, right? It is a dramatization of the idea. It is a scene. It's not a static, quote unquote, dead thing that can be easily translated. It is this sort of living dynamic process. It's not a symbol. It is always a metamorphosis. And we can't judge it by a sort of static end or outcome or output. It is the process. It is the dream work. The dream work's what's important, right? Not the manifest meaning, obviously, and not even the latent meaning to be, quote unquote, deciphered. It is the dream work. The work is what's important. So even the dream can't be like reduced, as Freud often wants to do, to simple wish fulfillment. That is a kind of static output. What happens to form the dream is what Derrida is interested in and sees in it a kind of analogy with writing in a non-classical sense. And that's why he's interested in the paths that are broken by the psychical system. It's those paths that are also kind of like the spacing of our writing.
This might be jumping a little bit, but I thought it was interesting that Derrida used mise en scène, which I think in his, right, it's like a term that you see in film, but I think the Webster's dictionary, like, I think that's the primary one that you'll see used today, but I think there's a secondary one that's like the physical setting of an action, which would sort of, I don't know, there's something with dream, like the dream and film,
yeah,
or like because of the gaps and the cuts and that kind of shit.
These terms, the mise terms, there's a lot of them in French. It's a very
Mise en
conventional,
place.
mise en place, right? Like, it's not just setting the table, it's all the work that goes into preparing food before it's cooked, right? Cutting onions and carrots and shit, preparing it is an active thing. And even mise en scène, we use it in, as you said, in language a lot of times to talk about setting. If you translate it literally, it'd be like setting the stage, but it's not quite that, right? The mise en scène, it involves a whole activity that goes into, as you said, the staging. I think would be a fairly good, a better translation to a certain extent, but it goes into, I like dramatization of the idea of the dream. The dream as a mise en scène is not just something that is set and then the activity takes place. It is part and parcel of the activity, without which the activity cannot take place.
That even makes sense if you're using the filmic definition, I think, too.
Okay, yeah, good.
Maybe not, because you have to, I guess it sort of depends.
It depends. And this is what I'm saying. This is why a lot of these terms aren't translated. They're just kept in French, because to translate them, you're going to lose something. So you just have mise en scène. Even mise, MIS, is a past participle. It implies that something has already taken place and been set. I think that is already a betrayal of what the idea means. It's not something that's just taken place in the past and then present activity happens. This calls into question temporalization,
Right.
temporality,
Yeah, exactly.
Linearity, and quote unquote full presence, because mise-en-scène is not something that just happened in the past and then activity happens. Mise-en-scène is like this. We could liken mise-en-scène,
Like it almost is the film, the reality or whatever the reality that is created is the mise-en-scène. Like it's the placement of and the spacing of the participants and the scenery and so forth.
It's the I
in
think
an
it's
imminent way
yeah.
that
Yeah.
that it becomes the film is the placement of the. So it's not like it's like an ongoing. It's not
It
it's like
is.
a present participle. I don't some shit like that.
Well, yeah, we could think about it that way. I
Present
think
perfect some shit.
Or a gerund. Since the gerund is a noun. So yeah, I would liken it more to a gerund than a, but I see it as breaching. It's the breaching, it's the path breaking that Derrida is talking about. I can liken mise-en-scène, the dramatization of the idea, as the path breaking that is what Freud is interested in when he's looking in 1895 at building this machine of neurones that interact, and they are literally breaking paths in the psychical system for excitations to travel and communicate and periodically invest. So the path breaking is part and parcel of the perceptual memory system, right? One can think of the very fact of like leaving traces in the unconscious. These registrations are path breaking. We can think of that substrate, that wax substrate, allows for path breaking to happen by having this surface that providing this receptive surface, this infinite receptivity, along with the perpetual virginal space for inscription. This is the thing that Freud has been looking for 30 years, and it's only with the mystic writing pad that he finally finds the analogy of this dual necessity, because a sheet of paper won't do it, and a blackboard, a slate that can be wiped clean, won't do it. It needs to have both. You need to have infinite receptivity along with this perpetually
Mutability or
virginal.
something. Yeah.
This perpetually virginal, this perpetually fresh slate with an infinite depth. You need a kind of infinite surface and an infinite depth, and you've only had one or the other in conventional senses in the history of writing. And it's with the mystic writing pad that we can see an analogy for what the psychical system represents.
Interestingly, too, I think I want to say it's Derrida actually that says there's like no, it was Freud. It was Freud because of the examples he uses. He draws this comparison between the technology that we use to store and our actual perceptual apparatus, like our physiobiological processes. Like he gives the example of the ear, the ear trumpet and glasses and
these prosthetics in a broad sense, the prostheses that extend
precisely
the capacity of our senses and abilities, right? The techne, if you will, the prosthetic. Freud's always very interested in these prostheses.
He talks about the camera the aperture of the lens and so forth. Something that I thought was kind of interesting as well. We don't have to go down this road, but just to mention it, I thought it would be interesting, and maybe I'm perhaps wrong, but speculatively here, be interested to see where this aspect of the discussion would play into Deleuze's time and movement image relative to like the dream and the mise-en-scène of the dream and the like perceptual apparatus due to that resemblance or that like sort of way that the trace of our biology is extended into the technical or something like that.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing, that what Derrida tries to show is if we start with a neurological machine in 1895, which was never published in the project for scientific psychology, and then we end up with the writing pad analogy, right? So we end up with the writing machine. It's in the interpretation of dreams that Derrida focuses for a short time, and I think this is what you're talking about, on how the psychical apparatus is likened to an optical machine. One of which is Derrida brilliantly kind of pulls out these passages of, because a lot of the work is, a lot of the path is broken by Freud. Not to question Derrida's originality because it's there, but Derrida has Freud do a lot of the work, breaking a lot of the paths, breaching a lot of these threads of the unconscious and conscious, likens to like a microscope and a telescope, and these, this is the cinematic ontology that I know that you're sort of interested in.
Exactly.
These visual metaphors.
Exactly. I'm glad you read my notes about that part, because that's definitely where I was, oh, okay, this is kind of interesting.
I guess the question would be, what I'll do, because I do want to break this path with you to continue the analogy. We could look at this with Cristobal Escobar next month when we have him on to discuss the intensive image. I think that'd be maybe a good time to come back to this question of the opticality of the unconscious in the interpretation of dreams. It's a book I've read a few times, but I hadn't really thought about it since rereading this essay about that optical metaphor. I would need to track those down and look at them again, but I think it's very interesting. I mean, Descartes talks about it, even Plotinus, and probably before, about this oculus mentis, this eye of the mind. The visual metaphor runs throughout, we could say, the history of metaphysics, the history of philosophy, and is this notion of a mind's eye is, even in conventional lay speak, still like exists. So it would be interesting to see, not just in Freud, but more generally, this question, as you're saying, of a kind of cinematic ontology. I think that one of the things that Derrida looks at real quickly is how Freud likens sort of the imprints, the traces in the unconscious as these like photographic negatives, right? He's
right. Yes.
I mean, Freud is thinking about how these technological developments are not just reflecting our sort of internal life, our psychical life, but perhaps inspired by them in terms of necessity and progress in the sciences. So that would be something I think we could return to, most definitely.
Just real quick, to draw that, to like wrap a bow on that, I think there's something interesting about the way that a video or film camera, right, like the eye, the lens of the eye or whatever, you have the aperture that regulates the amount of excitation or light per se that gets absorbed into the sensor in like a digital camera per se, or like a film, like the celluloid of film. It's writing with light and darkness.
Yeah.
So, which goes back to the space and the gaps and all that kind of shit that Derrida likes to bandy about.
You know, Simondon has a really interesting analogy. I know he talks about it in the individuation books I translated. It's possible he probably also brings it up in the technical objects book, but he talks about the traditional photographic negatives, where he even goes down to the question of definition and fineness of reception based on the molecules of the, I think they're silver molecules or some sort of silver mixture, that the receptive capabilities of the physical substrate of the photographic stuff. I mean, obviously not digital, right? Has its own analogy.
But you're right, absolutely. Those early, like whenever photography was like in its gestational, like I'm talking 1870s, 1880s. You did have these like silver oxide chemical things.
Yeah, so the granularity of the capacity, you can get down to the molecular level, and Simondon does a good job at sort of investigating this capability of perception and recording and registration. One can liken it to Freud, but he's on this material, physical level of the grains, of the molecules, and what they make possible. And there's a threshold beyond which a certain amount of definition, a certain amount of let's just say saturation of images that is not possible to cross unless one were to be able to refine that substrate. To go back to the language we've been using, right? There is a sense in which there is a kind of maximal saturation that's possible based on the materiality of the photographic substrate.
Yeah, which would kind of go back to like, maybe I'm wrong, but it sounds like death, right? The membrane, the protection, because if you too much exposure. Let's
I see.
and then your photograph is destroyed per se.
Right. Too much. I mean, this is why dark rooms, I obviously there's still classical photography one can think of, but yeah,
Sure.
why dark rooms are a thing. There is
Right.
a sense in which there needs to be a kind of protection from intensity, from luminous intensity here, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think that all of that's very apropos. How are you feeling about what we've done?
Pretty good, I think. I'm not sure if there's much else.
I mean, obviously we could talk about more Derridian stuff, but I was trying to stick to the stuff about deference, architrace. That really would require us to read of grammatology and stuff. You see, he's even citing himself.
Yeah, that's true.
I think that requires more reading and
This thing about consciousness arising in the perceptual system and not in the permanent traces. I think that goes back to maybe the discussion on originary, though, to some degree,
I
or
think,
like how
yeah.
we talked about, like the inscription surface has to presupposes or predates the writing or something like that.
I think for Derrida, just as speech presupposes writing, the consciousness, the perception system presupposes the recording of traces of memories. In traditional classical metaphysics, I think Derrida was trying to say, like, when one would think first we have the perception, it's the full present, and then we have memory that quote unquote stores it. And I think Derrida tries to show how that's not tenable. Just as speech presupposes writing, perception presupposes memory recording and memory traces. This is what he's getting at with the architrace and deference and all these things that he opens up the essay with. But the lecture isn't devoted to that. I think
Right.
that prologue that he added after the fact for this volume, he's trying to show a little bit, he's trying to do a little bit more legwork to show why he's interested in this question.
Gotcha.
Why he started reading Freud late after he's trained as a philosopher. So he's looking at the history of philosophy, the history of metaphysics. He's looking at Plato and all these other thinkers, and why he comes to Freud late and sees a contiguity and continuity and a discontinuity, right? He sees a Freud is complicating the history of metaphysics in its subordination of writing to speech, but at the same time he will fall back on these Platonic tropes, like I mentioned earlier, right? That writing would be another technical, a prosthetic aid to memory.
Yes, exactly.
That's one of the classical tropes, and Derrida wants to show that that's not the case. That would reproduce what I'm talking about here, where perception would be speech, it would be full presence, and then you would have something in the past that would be memory, that would be kind of dead, the dead letter, the dead writing, that would be passive. All of these binary oppositions that Derrida is trying to
Unravel.
complicate and deconstruct and show to be. He not only shows, or not only wants to argue that they structure the history of metaphysics, but they are in almost Heideggerian way, he wants to say that they are an inevitable precondition for metaphysics, and yet something that is not completely necessary. It's just almost something we have to like work through in a quasi-Freudian way, right? We have to kind of have to work through these symptoms, this symptomatic logocentrism.
I like that. That's good.
It's kind of an inevitable part of our history of thinking. Now, this is why I think Derrida will take up Heidegger and want to talk about the end of metaphysics, the death of metaphysics, which potentially implies the death of philosophy. I'd have to look more closely at Derrida and see if that becomes a theme. But it's a question about what is a post-metaphysical age. I think for someone like Deleuze, who wants to think of himself as a metaphysician, this question of a death of metaphysics, and Badiou, now when Badiou talks about it, he will also use metaphysics in a way that is disparaging, but sometimes he says metaphysics as a quasi synonymous with philosophy. But it was with Deleuze, at least, and Badiou, they are both like, the death of philosophy doesn't really quite make sense. They don't really understand this type of, I mean, what Nietzsche might call exhaustion. With Derrida, I think it's obviously the answer is never simple, but he does seem to inherent inherit this periodization of metaphysics along with Heidegger, even if he breaks it up into different epochs. But I do think he is thinking about the opening of logocentrism and its closure, its enclosing, something we have to break through, we have to work through. I think all of this is part and parcel of his Heideggerianism, his fidelity to Heidegger, but obviously his working through and beyond Heidegger. This is what stages the possibility for Laruel's non-philosophy, right? He is interested in, really, Derrida seems to set the stage, the mise-en-scène of non-philosophy. But Deleuze also provides one of the means on the other end, because I think Laruel is, for different reasons and for different, and with a different understanding than Deleuze, is not seeing philosophy's death anytime in the future. It's part and parcel of just our constellations of thought, of decision. But with Deleuze, against Deleuze, he doesn't support what he calls like Deleuze's naivete and his affirmationism, because to a certain extent, if the death of philosophy is suspect for Laruel, the afterlife, its survival, is just as suspect and begins to look like an aborted birth, as he calls it. And this is why non-philosophy is needed, just as Cubism and abstract art was needed for non-representational modes of visual art. 12-tone serialism was needed and has always been really in the history of music, but was a breakthrough for the history of Western music, was needed for these novel creations and mutations.
Do you want to wrap up there?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to close out the episode here, but thank you all for joining us for another episode of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. We'll see y'all next week with Graham Harmon.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious character. To the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.